Good morning and welcome to another daily devotion. Well, we've come to the last of the fruit of the Spirit that Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 5 verses 22 to 23, and it's self-control. How difficult it can be to control ourselves, whether that's our thoughts, words or actions. How often have you said something or done something and regretted it? But as someone once said, it's like toothpaste. Once it's out of the tube, you can never get it back in. It's too late. But if we have self-control, then perhaps we will avoid such difficult and embarrassing situations. See, self-control is the power to keep oneself in check. Often in the New Testament, and here particularly in Galatians, Paul is using it to refer to the issue of self-control over sexual desires and sexual issues, or giving in to sexual or physical desires, and to the attitudes and actions of the vices that he mentions in the previous verses, in verses 19 to 21. Paul says there that as non-Christians, they were prone to sexual immorality, to impurity, to idolatry, they were involved in witchcraft or practice of magic. They had hatred in their spirits, jealousy, envy, drunkenness. And all of those can be a major problem, can't they, even today? And these, he says, are attitudes or works of the flesh, or they're human-centered and driven by our human desires rather than by spiritual desires. However, what he's talking about in the whole of the issue with the fruit of the Spirit is that if the Holy Spirit comes to dwell within us and we allow him to work on us, then he will develop self-control in our hearts and our minds and help us to contend with those vices and replace them with the fruit of the Spirit and with following after God's will and God's plans, purposes and desires. See, there is within the Christian a constant battle between what is known in some of the scriptures as the old self and the new self, or the old nature and the new nature. That is, the nature before we were Christians and the nature that we should have once we are converted. Paul also refers to this as the battle between the flesh and the spirit. He mentions in Romans chapter 7, verses 18 to 20, how the problems that he faces himself came from within his own body. And later on in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 27, he further states this. He says, I keep my body under control and make it my slave, so I won't lose out after telling the good news to others. See, he was concerned that he couldn't just go on preaching the gospel and then live and allow his old nature to dictate how he lived, and to live in a manner which was contrary to the gospel and to the message that he was preaching. Or in another way, he's saying we have a responsibility to keep working at keeping our human desires in check, to keeping our old nature in check. And it's tough. It's a battle, because that human nature is very strong and it will rebel, if you like, against the spiritual nature that we are endeavoring to cultivate in our lives. And that old nature will try to have the preeminence. And so what Paul says here is, he said, you need to learn to keep yourselves under control. Keep yourself, your thoughts, your desires under control. Many things can cause us to lose our self-control. It can be a desire for pleasure, for fame, for fortune, for success, for popularity. All of these things can plague the Christian, especially the Christian leaders. And many have fallen into various traps which have caused their downfall in their Christian life and Christian service, because they have given in to some of these human temptations and desires of what is known as the flesh. And so we have to be so careful in our Christian lives as to how we live, act, and conduct ourselves. And remember this, the enemy knows our weakness. The enemy knows your weakness. And often he will play on that weakness to bring us to a point where we are tempted and where we can fall into sin. Just think of Jesus. Who would ever have thought that Jesus would be tempted? He was the perfect man, perfect God, without sin. And yet we see in Luke chapter 4 how he was tempted by the devil. The devil offered him an easy path to success. First of all, he said, why don't you make some bread out of these stones? Of course, Jesus had been in the wilderness. He'd been fasting now for 40 days. And he was hungry. And so the devil said, well, look, I don't know why you're hungry. You can do something about it. Just make these stone into bread. And then not only that, but further down the road, I'm sure that the people would have found out about this and they would have followed the man who could solve their hunger problems. Isn't that something which comes up in the story of the feeding of the 5,000, where the crowds follow Jesus and he says, you only followed me because I fed you. But Jesus rejected that possibility. Then, of course, the next one was the devil said, throw yourself off the temple. He said, let the angels catch you and they'll rescue you. You won't fall, you won't die. And, this spectacular sight, people will be drawn to you because you've done this spectacular act and God has intervened in your situation. So many people can be drawn away by the spectacular, looking in our lives, looking in our church, looking in our ministry for spectacular things to happen. I read something I think it was this morning actually, about Abraham. In a little daily reading book. We think of Abraham as having all these spectacular visitations from God. But the writer said he only really visited him every 12 to 14 years. The rest of his life was pretty mundane. And that's the same with us. We have to be careful that we're not always looking for the next big thing. We're not always thinking that today's got to be a spectacular day. We are called to live as Christians in this world on a daily basis. It wasn't the spectacular. And then, of course, Satan said to Jesus, well, just bow down and worship me. And he said, I'll give you all the wealth and glory of the nations. But Jesus had self-control, didn't he? He didn't do it. He didn't want to short-circuit his way to glory and to reigning. He knew that there was something far better in store. He knew that he had to go to the cross because he knew that he had to go to the cross in order for us to be saved. There was far more important things than him getting the power that the devil was offering at this particular time. We can be caught in very similar situations in our lives. We can be tempted with all sorts of similar things, even as Jesus was tempted with it, perhaps in not such a spectacular manner, but they can still be serious issues which can cause us to compromise our stance. Because we want to be popular, we want to be successful, we want to have the big church, or we want to have the popularity and the plaudits of the people in our circle of friends and circle of influence. And how can we be caught out in these issues? Well, if one of the ways is through money. Money can be the source of many problems. In fact, Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 10 that the love of money, notice there, the love of money, not money itself, but the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil. And it shows, he goes on to say that people will do all sorts of things. He says, I think it's something along the lines of he will pierce themselves through, which is a good King James translation, if I remember rightly, with all sorts of evil things. In other words, they'll get themselves into all sorts of unnecessary, unpleasant and sinful situations just because they want more money. Why? What's the point of compromising your faith, compromising your stance just so that you can have more money? Because sadly, as we also read, the more we have, often the unhappier people become. Money doesn't make us happy. We have to have self-control over our desire for material things, whether for money and for other material things, for bigger houses and bigger cars and more expensive clothes, and trying to outdo the neighbours or outdo that person who's in the church that has a better living than you. You just are jealous and envious of those kind of people. Be very careful. Demonstrate self-control. What about fame and power and popularity? Again, these are issues which we can be faced with as Christians. Simple, everyday living Christians can be faced with the desire to be popular. They'll do all sorts of things just to make themselves popular with other people in the church, to make themselves popular with people in the community, or to gain power and control within the church. What a sad situation that is. I've never understood people that want the power. Do you know, because with real power becomes responsibility. And we have to be very careful that we don't want to take the power, we don't want to make the decisions without the responsibility that we have in facing the consequences. Do you remember in 2 Samuel chapters 15 to 18, the story there is recorded of Absalom? Now, Absalom was one of David's sons, and he wanted to be the ruler. He wanted to be the judge in place of his father. He was a young man, apparently. He was a good-looking man. He had his long hair, and he used to have an annual haircut. It's a bit like us now in the lockdown. You know, everybody's waiting for their first haircut, aren't they? I'm fine. My wife does mine. It's cheaper as well. But he was a man who was full of pride, and his hair was his pride and joy. He usurped the throne of his father David. And the people loved him because he looked the part, and he said the right things. He said the things that they wanted to hear. But that was not God's plan either for Absalom or for Israel. And in fact, his pride was his downfall, because one of the soldiers came and said to David, "I saw Absalom hanging from an oak tree by his hair." The very thing that had been his pride and joy was the very thing that killed him. You know, sometimes we hold things so close and so dear to our hearts that they replace God in our lives. But those things can also become our downfall, our family, our hobby, our desire for popularity, or whatever it may be. We can hold something so dear that it replaces God. What a terrible situation for the Christian to be in, that they put anything above God in their lives. He should be first and foremost. Don't be like Absalom. Don't give in. You know, if only he'd have self-control and humility, and he'd waited for God to work. Yes, he might never have been king, but he would have been alive, and he would have been happy in the role that God had given him. Will you be happy today in the role that God has given you? Will you be happy with the gifts that God has given you? Will you be happy with the lot that God has given you in life? Will you learn self-control? Will you control your physical desires, your sexual desires, your desire for popularity, for power, for success, for fame? And will you allow the Lord to exalt you? Will you allow the Lord to make you who he wants you to be? For God's purposes will always far outweigh our thoughts and our efforts. The Bible teaches we must learn and practice self-control, controlling our desires, words and actions. Do you work at keeping yourself in check, of controlling your human desires, which can lead to sin? So the fruit of the Spirit. We come to the end of those lovely virtues and characteristics that Paul encourages us to develop in our lives through the Spirit. Are they apparent in your life? If they are, then there's every reason to believe that you are a true born-again Christian. May God bless you today and always. Amen.